So now it's time to make our login form look a bit better, and the way that we're going to achieve that is by sticking it in a modal. And let's take a look at the options that we have for modals inside Semantic UI React. And inside the modules section we have a modal, and pretty straightforward stuff. I'm sure you've seen modals before, and this is what we get. And we're just going to have a pretty simple modal, not that simple, and we'll use the default modal. And I'll just click on the try it and just copy the content of this into my clipboard, and let's go to VS Code and set this up. And what we're going to do, modals can live anywhere in our application, and we want to control the opening and closing of the modal from our MobX store, which is also available from anywhere in our application. So I'm just going to close down the open windows, and inside the client app, inside source, inside the app and common folder, I'm just going to create a new folder for modals. And inside here I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this modal container.tsx. And I'll create the structure for our components, and then I'm just going to paste in the content of the modal that I copied from Semantic UI, and I'm just going to bring in all missing imports from here. And we're not going to use the image anyway, so I'm just going to remove that. And I'm also going to remove the modal description and the modal header and actually the modal trigger as well. So I probably could have just typed this in, especially as I'm also removing the image. So I agree, that was pretty pointless copying that, and our component will go here, will all that I display at this time from our modal, and just reformat. And we don't need the button or the header in here either. So I mentioned we're going to control the opening and closing of the modal from a MobX store. So what we'll also do is create a store especially for our modals, and I'll create a new file inside stores, and I'll call it modalstore.ts. And the structure of this particular store will be the same as any other, so I'm just going to say export default class and modal store. And as a class property, I'll specify the root store as type of root store. And once again, the automatic import has let me down, so I'll just import it manually. And root store is a named import, so I'll say import root store from root store. And then I'll add the constructor and pass in the root store here as type of root store. And then I'll just say list.rootStore equals root store. And what we'll do is we'll create an observable, and it's going to be called modal. And it's going to have two properties inside this object. It's going to be either open or not open, so I'll set the open is false initially, and the body of the modal I'll just set to null initially. And then we're going to create two actions. One to open the modal, and this will take in the content of the modal, and I'll just give it a type of any. And I'll say list.modal.open equals true, and I'll say list.modal.body equals the content. And the content in this case is going to be our components. So our login form is going to be inside the body of this modal. And we'll also do the same for closing the modal. We'll say action to close modal equals, with no parameters, and we'll say list.modal.open equals false, and this.modal.body equals null. And we're getting some errors here, but I haven't actually added this to the root store yet. So let's open up the root store so we can add this in there. And I'll specify the modal store as a class property of type modal store. and I'll import this manually. And from modal store, and then just add this in the constructor and say list.modalStore equals new modal store, and pass in this for our root store. And the errors have gone away. So let's configure our modal container to make use of these methods and the modal itself. And inside the modal container, I'll say const root store equals use context, and pass in the root store context, and then say const, and what we want from here, I'll just say root equals root store dot modal store, and then let's destructure what we want from here. Now we'll need to bring in the modal, and we want to bring in the two properties, the open and the body, and we also want the close modal from our modal store. And our modal itself takes some properties, and one of them is open. So we can use the open property and set this to open. And we also want to set the onClose equal to close modal. And we also want to give this a size equal to mini. Otherwise it's going to take up quite a large portion of our page. And inside the modal content, we'll just specify, in fact, we'll leave this for now, and I'll just say our component will go here. Let's just make sure we can actually open a modal first of all. And what we also want to do is put our modal container somewhere very high up in our application, because we're going to be opening this from our home page itself. And we want our modal to appear on top of this. So we'll give this a location high up in our application. So I'm just going to open up the app.tsx, and just below the first fragment here, I'm just going to add in our modal container and make sure this has been brought in correctly, because automatic importing is being very hit and miss at the moment in VS Code. And then what we can do is go to our home page, and instead of using a link to log in, let's add an onClick event, and we want to open our modal, which means we'll need to bring in, as well as our user store here, we'll also need to bring in our modal store, or destructure the properties from here. So I'll say root store.modal store. And what we want to bring in here is the open modal. And what we can do here is, in the onClick event, is I'll just add an arrow function and say open modal. And I haven't left the content as optional, so let's just add a string of text called test. And let's just go and see if we can actually open our modal now. So if I click login, nothing happens. But there is something that I've forgotten to do, and that's in the modal container itself. We need to make this an observer, so that when our observables change, we're actually observing those changes inside our modal container. So we also need to make this an observer as well, just like any other component. And I'll wrap this in the observer higher order component we get from MobX React Lite. And let's go back and take a look. And now if I click login, we get our modal opening. But obviously we want to display our login form here. And let's just go back, and we'll replace the text inside here with body. And let's go back to our home page, and instead of the string of text that we weren't doing anything with anyway, let's add our login component, or our login form, so that we open this when we open our modal. And if we click on login, then we get an error. And if we take a look at what the error actually is, this tells us that since strict mode is enabled, changing observable values outside actions is not allowed. And specifically, it's referring to the modal body and something to do with underscore store validated. And I sort of left this in place on purpose just so that I can demonstrate a particular feature of MobX when it comes to observable objects. And by default, and let's just go back to our modal store. Now, by default, when we create an observable that is an object, then it's going to observe this as deep by default. It's going to, when we add a component here, a React component, that's not a simple property, it's a complex property, or an object that has many properties. And our observable here is attempting to observe deeply what's inside the body. Now, we don't want that behavior for our modals, and what we can do is specify observable.shallow, and this decorates it so that the observable converts its value into a shallow observable structure, and it's only going to go one level deep, which means this is not going to be observed deeply, and it's just going to be an observable on the first level of our React component. And if we go back and take a look and click on login, now we can see that we get our login form, and that's what we're looking for. Although, let's tidy things up inside our login form, and I'll just go back and let's open up the login form one more time, and let's give it a header first of all. So I'll just add a header inside the form and bring this in from semantic UI, and we'll say as equals h2, and the content will be login to reactivities, and we'll give it a color equal to teal in this case, and we'll set the text align equal to center, and just reformat this, and we'll just make the button fluid so it uses the full width of the modal as well. And let's go back and take a look at this, and if I click login, then that part's okay, but I've forgotten to remove this, so let's go back to the login form again, and I'll take out the JSON stringify content for our form state there. We also don't need this break anymore either, and let's just remove any unused imports here or properties, and I can remove the form, and let's go and take a look now. And if I click login, that's a bit better, although I might make the button teal as well. So I'm just going to go back, make one more tiny change, and change this from a positive button and give it a color equal to teal. And if we go back and take a look again, that's a bit more like it. And if I try and do anything and click out, we get the validation. If I try and log in with a bad password, then we get unauthorized, and that's all looking better. Although I'm not particularly happy with this error message that we're doing here, we can do something better with this. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at what we can do for that next.